Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions for you. I and many listeners of this podcast are obsessed with dopamine. And what is dopamine? How does it work? We all hear that dopamine is this molecule associated with pleasure. I think the term dopamine hits, like I'm getting a dopamine hit from this, from Instagram or from likes or from praise or from whatever, is now commonly heard. What is dopamine? And what are maybe some things about dopamine that most people don't know, and probably that I don't know either?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are those molecules that bridge the gap between two neurons. So they essentially allow one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. Dopamine is intimately associated with the experience of reward, but also with movement, which I think is really interesting because movement and reward are linked, right? If you think about early humans, you had to move in order to go seek out the water or the meat or whatever it was. And even in the most primitive organisms, dopamine is released when food is sensed in the environment. For example, C. elegans, a very primitive worm. So dopamine is this really powerful, important molecule in the brain that helps us experience pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, but it's a really, really important one. And if you want to think about something that most people don't know about dopamine, which I think is really interesting, is that we are always releasing dopamine at a kind of tonic baseline rate. And it's really the deviation from that baseline rather than like hits of dopamine in a vacuum that make a difference. So when we experience pleasure, our dopamine release goes above baseline. And likewise, dopamine can go below that tonic baseline. And then we experience a kind of pain.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that one's baseline levels of dopamine, how frequently we are releasing dopamine in the absence of some, drug or food or experience, just sitting, being, is that associated with how happy somebody is, their kind of baseline of happiness or level of depression?
There is evidence that shows that people who are depressed may indeed have lower tonic levels of dopamine. So that's a really reasonable thought. And there's some evidence to suggest that that may be true. The other thing that we know, and this is, really kind of what the book is about, is that if we expose ourselves chronically to substances or behaviors that repeatedly release large amounts of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, that we can change our tonic baseline and actually lower it over time as our brain tries to compensate for all of that dopamine, which is more really than we were designed to experience.
Interesting. And is it the case that our baseline levels of dopamine are set by our genetics, by our heredity?
Well, I think, if you think about sort of, the early stages of development in infancy, certainly that is true. You're kind of, born with probably whatever is your baseline level, but obviously your experiences can have a huge impact on where your dopamine level ultimately settles out.
So if somebody's disposition is one of constant excitement and anticipation, or easily excited, these are, I think about the kind of people where you say, hey, do you want to check out this new place for tacos? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. And other people are a little more cynical, harder to budge, like my bulldog Costello. Very, very stable, low levels of dopamine with big inflections in his case. Do you think that's set in terms of our parents, and obviously nature and nurture interact, but is dopamine at the core of our temperament?
I don't really think we know the answer to that, but I will say that people are definitely born with different temperaments, and those temperaments do affect their ability to experience joy. And we've known that for a long time, and we describe that in many different ways. One of the ways that we describe that in the modern era is to use psychiatric nomenclature, like this person has a dysthymic temperament, or, this person has chronic major depressive disorder. In terms of looking specifically at who's vulnerable to addiction, that's an interesting sort of mixed bag, because when you look at the research on risk factors for addiction, so what kind of temperament of a person makes them more vulnerable to addiction, you see some interesting findings. First, you see that people who are more impulsive are more vulnerable to addiction. So what is impulsivity? That means having difficulty putting space between the thought or desire to do something and actually doing it. And people who have difficulty putting a space there, who have a thought to do something and just do it impulsively, are people who are more vulnerable to addiction.
Interesting. Could I in terms of impulsivity, is this something that relates literally to the startle reflex? Like for instance, as a lab director, I'm familiar with walking around my lab, and when I deciding I'm going to talk to my people, of course, when they knock on my door, it's always like, wait, why am I being bothered right now? Even though I love to talk to them, but I walk around my lab from time to time, and some people I notice, I'll say, do you have a moment? And they'll slowly turn around and say, yeah, or no, in some cases. And other people will jump the moment I say their name. They actually have a kind of a heightened startle reflex.
Right. Is
that related to impulsivity, or is what you're referring to an attempt to withhold behavior that's very deliberate under very deliberate conditions?
Yeah, so I don't think that startle reflex is necessarily related to impulsivity. That can be related to anxiety. So people who are high anxiety people will tend to have more of a startle reflex. Impulsivity is a little bit different. And by the way, impulsivity is not always bad, right? Impulsivity is that thing where there's not a lot of self-editing or worrying about future consequences. You have the idea to do something and you do it. And of course, we can imagine many scenarios where that's absolutely wonderful. There can be a sort of, let's say, intimate interactions between people where you wouldn't really want to be super inhibited about it, right? You would want to be disinhibited and impulsive. I can also imagine sort of fight or flight scenarios, like battle scenarios, right? Where it would really be good to be impulsive and just go, rah, just
where hesitation can cost you your life.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But, and I think this brings up a really, something that I've come to believe after 25 years of practicing psychiatry is that what we now conceptualize in our current ecosystem as mental illness are actually traits that in another ecosystem might be very advantageous. They're just not advantageous right now because of the world that we live in. And I think, impulsivity is potentially one of those, right? Because we live in this world that's sort of like you have to constantly be thinking sort of rationally about the consequences of X, Y, or Z. And it's such a sensory rich environment, right? That we're being bombarded with all of these opportunities, these sensory opportunities, and we have to constantly check ourselves. And so impulsivity is something that right now can be a difficult trait, but isn't in and of itself a bad thing.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm beginning to realize it's a fine line between spontaneity and impulsivity.
Yeah.
What is pleasure and how does it work at the biological level? And if it feels right at the psychological level? I think if you don't mind painting a picture of sort of the range of things that you have observed in your clinic or in life that people can become addicted to. But just to start off really simply, what is this thing that we call pleasure?
Well, I think it's actually really hard to define pleasure in any kind of succinct way, because certainly there is the seeking out of a high or a euphoria, or I think the kind of experience that most anybody would associate with the word pleasure, but also the seeking out of those same substances and behaviors is often a way to escape pain. So, for example, when I talk to people with addiction, sometimes their initial foray into using a drug is to get pleasure, but very often it's a way to escape their suffering, whatever their suffering may be. And certainly as people become addicted, even those who initially were seeking out pleasure are ultimately just trying to avoid the pain of withdrawal or the pain of the consequences of their drug use. So I think it's, very hard to actually, define it as this unitary thing. And it's certainly not just getting a high. There are so many ways in which people sort of want to escape, which is not the same thing as sort of this hedonic, wanting to feel pleasure.
So someone could decide that they want to go out and dance or get up and dance because of the pleasure of dancing. I can imagine that. But maybe it's very difficult for them to stay seated when a particular song comes on, or for instance, but seeking what we would call pleasure in order to eliminate pain, that evokes a different picture in my mind. That evokes a picture of somebody that feels lost or depressed or underwhelmed. I definitely want to get into the precise and general description of addiction and what that is. But in a previous conversation we had, you said something that really rung in my mind, which is that many people who become addicted to things, let's call them addicts, have this feeling that normal life isn't interesting enough, that they are seeking a supernormal experience, and that the day-to-day routine, balance, which is actually in the title of your book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, that the word balance itself can sometimes be a bit of an aversive term for people. And I'm struck by this idea, and the reason I want to explore it is because so much of what I see online is about generating a lack of balance, about being tilted forward at all times, really leaning into life hard, experiencing life, living a full life. Even the commencement speech given by Steve Jobs on this campus was really about finding passion, digging, that's so much in the narrative now. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your experience with this association, if it really exists, between people's sense of the normalcy or maybe even how boring life can be and their tendency to become addicts of some sort.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that life for humans has always been hard, but I think that now it's harder in unprecedented ways. And I think that the way that life is really hard now is that it actually is really boring. And the reason that it's boring is because all of our survival needs are met, right? I mean, we don't even have to leave our homes to meet every single physical need, as long as you're of a certain level of financial well-being, which frankly, we talk so much about, the income gap, and certainly there is this enormous gap between rich and poor, but that gap is smaller than it's ever been in like the history of humans. Even the poorest of the poor have more excess income to spend on leisure goods than they ever have before in human history. If you look at leisure time, for example, so people without a high school education have 42% more leisure time than people with a college degree. So my point here is that life is hard now in this really weird way, in that we don't really have anything that we have to do. So we're all forced to make stuff up, whether it's being a scientist or being a doctor or being an Olympic athlete or, climbing Mount Everest. And people really vary in their need for friction. And some people need a lot more than others. And if they don't have it, they're really, really unhappy. And I do think that a lot of the people that I see with addiction and other forms of mental illness are people who need more friction. Like they're unhappy not necessarily because there's something wrong with their brain, but because their brain is not suited to this world.
And do you think they have that sense? My brain isn't suited to this world, or they simply feel a restlessness and they're constantly seeking stimulation?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's not really knowing what's wrong with me. Why am I unhappy? How can I be happier? And of course, as you talk about what's so pervasive in our narrative now is like, find your passion, find your, whatever it is to save the world. And in a way that's good because it has people out in the world and seeking. But in a way it can also be misleading in the sense that I think people aren't entirely aware that the world is a hard place and that life is hard and that, like we're all kind of making it up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's a book by Cal Newport. I don't know if you know Cal Newport's work, but you guys are very symbiotic in your messages. He's a professor of computer science at Georgetown. Yes, at Georgetown, and wrote a book some years ago, really ahead of its time, called So Good They Can't Ignore You, which is about not meditating or doing much work to try and figure out what one's passion is by thinking, but rather go out and acquire skills,
right,
and develop a sense of passion for something by your experience of hard work and getting better and feedback. Right. A little bit of the growth mindset thing, right, of our colleague Carol Dweck, but he's gone on to write books, Deep Work, and which is all about removing yourself from technology and doing deep work.
Yes, right.
And he's been a big proponent of the evils of context switching too often throughout the day.
Yeah.
For sake of productivity, mostly. His new book is called A World Without Email. I'm beginning to realize as I cite off these books and your book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, that maybe the reason why you two don't know about one another is because neither of you are on social media.
That's it.
Right.
That's
and
it.
yet you're two of the most productive people that I know, including productive authors. So that's a discussion unto itself. But I find this fascinating. So